He was the only black man in the room, and they made him refill the coffee like it was part of his job, like he didn't have a degree, a title, or a seat at the table he helped build. Not a whisper of hesitation from the executives who smirked while he poured their drinks. Not a single word of protest from a room that had watched him show up early, stay late, and carry the weight of work others took credit for. They didn't know who he really was, didn't care. All they saw was someone they thought they could step over, someone who would never speak, never push back. But what they didn't see was the truth that was already closing in on them. This is the story of how arrogance collapsed a billion-dollar deal. How a man they tried to erase became the one person they couldn't ignore. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think is coming next. The story has just begun. The morning air held the muted weight of a spring rain as Thaddeus Lane stepped out of the subway tunnel and into the thrumming rhythm of Midtown Manhattan. His reflection shimmered on the wet sidewalk, distorted by streaks of runoff from awnings above. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket, shifted his leather satchel higher onto his shoulder, and walked with the quiet composure of a man who had learned to make himself invisible while carrying the pedigree to command a room. The skyscraper loomed above him like a monolith of glass and reputation. Halverson and Burke, known for their aggressive corporate takeovers and ruthless bottom line. Thaddeus paused only once before entering, his eyes scanning the spinning doors like a soldier approaching a checkpoint. He had prepared for this. Wharton had not come easy, nor had the years of relentless networking, sleepless analysis reviews, and late-night flights between secondary offices and deal rooms. But this was his next frontier. Inside the lobby, the contrast was immediate. Security eyed him with a strange pause before handing over a guest badge with the word temp written in permanent marker. He looked down at the tag, brows drawn just slightly. He said nothing. The receptionist didn't ask his name. She simply gestured toward a separate elevator bank with the word support staff printed above in brass lettering. A woman in scrubs entered ahead of him, pushing a cart of bottled water. He held the door open for her. As the elevator climbed, he heard laughter filter in from another lift across the lobby, the one marked executive access only. Floor 31. The doors opened with a chime, revealing a stark corridor and a series of low cubicles lit by sterile white light. A man in rolled-up sleeves leaned over a desk as he looked up. "You're the guy for facilities?" he asked without standing. Thaddeus paused. "No, I'm..." The man waved a hand, uninterested. "We've got a leak in the west kitchen. Water everywhere. Maintenance closet is down the hall. Key should be on the hook." Thaddeus didn't argue. He didn't protest. He turned, found the key, and followed the narrow hallway until he stood ankle-deep in standing water with a stack of towels and a wrench. His hands, normally reserved for keystrokes and financial projections, were now drenched in rust-colored water as he clamped the pipe shut and dragged a mop across the tile. 27 minutes passed before anyone even acknowledged the error. "You're not with facilities," said the same man, now with a sheepish tone. "HR didn't say you were." "Yeah. Well, someone should have told the front desk." Thaddeus cleaned his hands in silence, wiped his forearms dry with brown paper towels, and returned to the lobby where his official welcome packet waited. No apology, no clarification, no direct eye contact. He made his way back to the executive floor, where Coltamar, director of operations, waited in a glass-walled office that overlooked the Chrysler Building like a throne room of finance. Colton stood, barely nodded, then glanced at the water-stained sleeves of Thaddeus's dress shirt. "You're late," he muttered, tapping a pen against his appointment calendar. "This isn't a company that waits for anyone." Thaddeus, still holding the HR packet and a drip-splotched leather satchel, apologized once. It was not accepted. Colton explained in clipped tones that due to a recent internal shift, Thaddeus's assignment would be redirected to a floating support role within business operations. Not strategy, not client work, not the track he had been recruited for. When Thaddeus mentioned his original offer letter and designation, Colton's brow lifted as if amused. "A lot of people want to start at the top," he said without smiling. "Prove yourself and we'll talk." Thaddeus said nothing more. By the afternoon, he was given a cubicle wedged between two printer stations, his name taped to the wall in black ink on white paper. The office manager walked by and asked him to sign for toner deliveries. A junior analyst mistook him for IT and asked about a broken HDMI cable. No one offered a tour. No one invited him to lunch. He watched from the corner as colleagues gathered in conference rooms, passed notes, laughed over catered sandwiches. On Thursday, a welcome breakfast was hosted for new hires. Thaddeus wasn't informed. He found the remains of the spread, half-cut bagels and cold coffee, by accident while delivering printouts to finance. He took nothing. On Friday, he wore the same gray suit he had worn Monday. It had been dry cleaned overnight. He reviewed an acquisition file no one asked him to read and caught an inconsistency in the asset valuation that could have cost the firm $300,000. He sent the correction to Colton's inbox with footnotes and sources. There was no reply, but later, Colton referenced the correction in a meeting as if it were his own discovery. Thaddeus stood at his cubicle listening to the recap through a cracked door. When he turned back to his desk, someone had moved his chair. It now sat slightly too low and wouldn't adjust. He walked toward the executive offices, passing walls of backlit glass that revealed high-ceilinged conference rooms, whiteboards scribbled with figures, and colleagues in tailored wool laughing between meetings. Colton's assistant barely glanced up as he approached, motioning toward the open door. Inside, Colton sat on the edge of his desk, flipping through a printed report. He didn't look up when Thaddeus stepped in. "We moved you," he said, turning a page. "Got a few new hires and needed the space. You'll be downstairs for now, closer to vendor services." Thaddeus remained still. Colton finally glanced at him, then offered a thin, professional shrug. "It's temporary. Think of it as agile seating. Flexible." There was no mention of performance, no acknowledgement of his completed models, his correction on the Osaka projections, or his late nights revising internal forecasts. Just movement. Quiet removal from visibility. The new desk was tucked into a half-partitioned corridor on floor 17, where the air smelled faintly of cardboard and fluorescent dust. Beside his chair stood a stacked row of file boxes labeled janitorial, HR archive, and server, red markers bleeding from damp edges. There was no window, no carpet, no noise except the occasional thud of a service elevator unloading supplies. Thaddeus sat down, opened his laptop, and resumed his work. No complaints. No calls. By lunchtime, he was asked to assist in processing a backlog of vendor invoices unrelated to his role. When he questioned the task, the senior analyst in charge simply nodded and said Colton had asked him to help wherever needed. His reply was polite. His eyes said otherwise. In the elevator later that day, an intern entered and glanced at Thaddeus's badge. "Oh," the intern said, voice low, "you're the compliance guy, right? The one who makes sure the chairs don't squeak and the printer trays stay stocked." The intern laughed once, too quickly, then looked down. Thaddeus said nothing. On Wednesday, the firm celebrated the quarterly close with catered breakfast and a roundtable meeting in the main auditorium. When Thaddeus arrived, the room was nearly full. He stood near the sidewall again, clutching his tablet. Colton stood near the podium, calling out departments by name: strategy, legal, acquisitions, risk. When he reached operations, he paused and smiled. "And let's not forget our MVP of the month," he said with exaggerated cheer. "The man who makes sure our paper supplies never run out. Seriously, that printer's been humming like a dream." Thaddeus Lane, everyone. Scattered claps followed, some genuine, some confused, some amused. Thaddeus stood still, then offered a brief nod. He did not smile. He did not move. The next morning, his company profile had changed. Where once there had been a sharp-cropped headshot and a 3-line biography detailing his background in financial modeling and international market strategy, now there was a placeholder image of a cartoon wrench and the words operational liaison. Below that, his department was listed as logistics support. No one responded to the email he sent asking to correct the information. When he followed up with HR, the system bounced his message back with an automated reply: recipient unavailable. The HR rep who had onboarded him no longer worked there. No replacement had been assigned. On Friday, he received a request to assist with rearranging office furniture in one of the unoccupied wings being prepared for renovations. The project lead claimed it would only take an hour. It lasted until sundown. By the time Thaddeus returned to his desk, a manager from records had taken his chair. The man apologized, saying he had been told the desk was free. His equipment was boxed on the floor. The label read excess inventory. He asked Colton's assistant for clarification. She offered none, just shrugged and said, maybe talk to facilities? He spent the last hour of the day seated on a stool near the kitchenette, reviewing quarterly asset trends with his laptop perched on his lap. No one spoke to him. No one even asked if he was on staff. The following week, his access to the executive floor was revoked. His badge now opened only 3 doors: his basement-level hallway, the copy room, and the shared kitchen. He stopped receiving calendar invites. His email signature was updated without his input. His phone extension was deactivated. When a courier dropped off a package addressed to Colton, the receptionist directed him to Thaddeus's location, saying, just leave it with the office guy. By now, even the security staff had stopped making eye contact. People passed him in the hall without acknowledgement, sometimes with faint surprise, as if he were a visiting temp or a contractor. Even his name seemed to erode. He overheard someone refer to him as Terrence during a compliance call. Silent contribution, invisible credit. Still, Thaddeus did the work. That morning, he attempted to join a departmental call on performance optimization. His calendar invite had no link. When he called into the room directly, he was told the call had been moved. No updated dial-in was provided. The same meeting later appeared in the internal newsletter with screenshots of the participants. His name, unsurprisingly, was not listed. Around noon, Colton hosted a Culture Sync meeting for junior associates, held in the main conference lounge. There were signs posted in the elevators, on Slack, and in the hallway leading to the lounge doors. Thaddeus arrived on time, paused at the edge of the room, and waited. The room buzzed with laughter and the smell of catered Italian food. A junior analyst named Harris, the same one who'd once asked Thaddeus for printer help, walked past him without recognition. Colton stood by the center table, shaking hands and pointing at people like a man giving stage directions. He caught sight of Thaddeus and offered a slow blink. No wave, no nod, just turned and kept talking. The closest empty seat was taken before Thaddeus could move. He backed against the wall unnoticed. When someone asked Colton who the new guy by the snack bar was, Colton glanced over and said, "Oh, that's our ops guy. He keeps us from flooding the office." A few people laughed. Thaddeus didn't move. He stayed for the full hour, standing through it all, listening to ideas that mirrored his own memos, reworded and presented by others. At one point, he was asked to grab napkins from the storage cabinet by a senior manager who mistook him for the service staff. He complied. Later, when the meeting ended, no one thanked him. He returned to his corner, typed for another 2 hours, and sent a logistics analysis to Colton marked urgent. The read receipt showed it was opened within 5 minutes. There was no reply. The next day, a client from an international partner firm visited headquarters. Everyone on the 24th floor was given name tags and brief bios to wear during introductions. Thaddeus's badge was missing. He inquired at reception, only to be told that his credentials must have been caught in the printer error. No reprint was issued. Instead, the receptionist handed him a blank visitor badge. When introductions began, Colton swept through the room with his signature ease, announcing staff one by one with glowing titles: strategist, consultant, operations lead. When he passed Thaddeus, he patted him on the back and said, "Support functions." A real jack of all trades. The client smiled, confused, and nodded. Thaddeus offered a short greeting and stepped back. At the luncheon that followed, the seating chart listed every guest and host by name and department. Thaddeus's name was handwritten at the bottom of the last page, squeezed between a typo and a footnote about dietary preferences. The seat assigned to him was at the far end of the table, next to the AV technician and one of the janitorial leads. They talked briefly about basketball and subway delays, which Thaddeus appreciated more than anything said by Colton that day. That evening, he returned to his desk to find that his company profile had been changed again. His name now linked to a generic internal alias shared by floating analysts with no department code. When he called IT to request the change be reversed, the technician told him the ticket would need director-level approval. He submitted the request to Colton. It was marked received and never updated. On Thursday, a quarterly report he had compiled, a thorough risk profile of a prospective merger, was printed and distributed with no attribution. The PDF footer still carried his initials in the metadata, but the front page had been branded with Colton's signature. The department read it in silence during the strategy call. When Colton explained the projections, he stumbled over 3 key data points. No one corrected him. Thaddeus stayed muted on the call, waiting. Colton recovered quickly and moved on. No one asked who built the model. That night, when Thaddeus returned to the shared storage space to retrieve his umbrella, he found his shelf labeled with a sticky note, "Miscellaneous Staff." His name had been crossed out. Next to it, someone had scribbled "Supply Helper" in red ink. On Friday, the firm held a charity auction for community outreach. Department heads were invited to donate themed baskets, and employees could bid using points accrued through company milestones. When Thaddeus asked where to submit his basket, the events coordinator paused and said, "We usually only take contributions from team leads, but you can help us set up the tables if you like." He agreed silently and spent the afternoon arranging floral centerpieces and taping tablecloths. When the event began, he stood at the back wall beside the fire exit, watching his colleagues laugh, bid, sip wine, and pose for group photos. Someone handed him a tray of hors d'oeuvres and mistook him for catering. When he said nothing, they dropped a napkin into his hand and walked away. He stayed until the final bid. He cleaned up the empty glasses. He wiped down the counters. He returned to his corner desk after everyone had gone and revised a spreadsheet for an acquisition team who wouldn't know his name. At 10:15 that night, he shut off his laptop and walked to the elevator alone. The question wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't mocking. It was just careless. He gave no answer. When he arrived at his workstation, a corner near the janitorial utility sink previously used to store old routers and toner cartridges, he found a new surprise waiting for him. His desk had been replaced with a collapsible plastic table, the kind used for weekend flea markets or emergency flood response. His chair was missing altogether. In its place was a broken rolling stool, its cushion lopsided and torn, foam exposed like surgical gauze. A laminated note rested on the table. Facilities requested a reassignment of unused furniture. Contact admin for discrepancies. There was no contact name, no extension, no apology. He stood still for a moment, the humming of the overhead light sharp and constant, then calmly placed his briefcase on the table and began working. He adjusted his laptop, opened the expense audit spreadsheet from a shared drive, and began typing with his back hunched to compensate for the height of the stool. His knees ached by mid-morning. At noon, Colton Marr passed by without breaking stride and muttered a reminder that the firm's dress code was shifting. "Some teams are piloting a more functional aesthetic," he said, loud enough for the interns nearby to hear. That afternoon, Thaddeus received a folded uniform shirt delivered by internal mail. It was a navy polo embroidered with the Halverson and Burke logo and the phrase "Operations Assistant." No explanation was included. The fabric smelled like cardboard and starch. He found no one else wearing it. Not in his corridor. Not in the executive lounges. No one in accounting. No one in legal. Just him. He folded it neatly, placed it in his drawer, and returned to his work. The degradation was no longer just social. It was structural. His name continued to vanish from the company directory. His calendar was blank. His phone line disconnected. He had submitted 6 workflow improvements that week. 5 were cited in internal briefings. None bore his name. He sat on the uneven stool for 12 hours each day, taking breaks only to stretch his legs in the back hallway between the freight elevator and the document shredder. He ate lunch alone at a folding table next to boxes marked surplus and e-waste. On Wednesday, his access badge failed at the main entrance. He waited 12 minutes before a building supervisor reactivated it and mumbled that some ID permissions had been shuffled in the system. No one explained why. That evening, a new directive circulated. Employees working on non-strategic projects would need to relocate to the basement annex during renovation. The list was alphabetical. His name was the only one on it. The next morning, he was given a key card and a map to a room labeled Logistics Overflow. It was located 2 floors below ground level, past the supply cage and next to an old file scanning station. The room was cold, lit by a single overhead tube, with a permanent smell of mildew and printer toner. 2 folding chairs sat in opposite corners. There were no windows, no Wi-Fi. The walls were covered in insulation foam and pipes. The desk was a dented metal table. The email said he'd be there until further notice. He set up his laptop. There was no phone signal. That Friday, he was asked to carry boxes to a courier drop point on the 6th floor. The boxes were labeled Exec 2023 and contained branded gifts for C-level clients, leather-bound notebooks, fountain pens, and cufflinks with Halverson and Burke's logo. Colton passed him in the hall and gave him a curt nod. "Make sure the ribbons are straight," he said, smirking slightly. Thaddeus carried the boxes in silence. He did not attend that afternoon's happy hour held on the rooftop. He was not invited. The next week, his company email signature was updated again without notice. It now read Logistics Resource Interim. His previous title, Associate Strategic Operations, had been erased. The building's intranet listed him under Auxiliary Services. When he contacted IT to restore the original designation, the request was denied. The system showed no record of his original job title. Even the HR contact who had welcomed him on his first day no longer worked there. Her name had been replaced in the system by a general inbox labeled Workforce Admin. He sent 3 messages. None were answered. On Thursday, a consultant from an outside firm visited the office to evaluate internal efficiency. Staff were told to prepare overviews of their workflows. Thaddeus submitted a detailed process map and a proposal to streamline document reconciliation using a hybrid tagging system. The consultant was never shown his materials. Later that day, Colton stood in front of a team in the glass conference room and presented a nearly identical strategy as part of his own efficiency initiative. He even used the same language. Thaddeus watched through the glass. At no point was his name mentioned. At no point was he acknowledged. By Friday, the basement room had begun to feel like a form of exile. A forgotten box had been left by the door. Its label read Thaddeus Lane, Temp Storage. Inside was a framed certificate from Morton, a company mug he hadn't ordered, and a photo of him shaking hands with the firm's VP taken during his first week. He stared at the image. Neither man was smiling. The photo had been marked with a note in blue ink, "Reassign file." The message wasn't clear. His body had grown used to the uneven stool. His eyes no longer flinched at the flickering light. His hands typed just as fast. His posture remained poised, and his mind stayed sharp even as the world tried to blunt it. Yet today, something shifted, not in relief, but in the direction of escalation. Before his first sip of coffee, a calendar invite appeared with no subject line and a vague location. Executive North Wing Conference Lounge, 9:15 a.m. It was a space he hadn't entered in over 2 weeks. He accepted without asking why, shut his laptop gently, and made his way to the elevator. At the security panel, his card paused before the green light flashed. A soft beep followed. Entry granted. Upstairs, the hallway was lined with polished floors and gleaming windows, the air thick with cologne and expensive perfume, and the lounge bustling with neatly dressed executives and associates. The tone was light, tinged with the forced camaraderie of corporate celebration. Colton Marr stood near the front of the room, dressed in an impeccable slate suit, greeting people with backslaps and jokes that elicited nervous laughter. At the far end of the lounge, a screen projected the title, Team Excellence Recognition Q1 Awards. Chairs were arranged in arcs, champagne bottles lined the side tables, and at the center, a small podium stood beneath recessed lights. Thaddeus took a seat near the back, unnoticed. Several associates glanced at him, their expressions momentarily puzzled before looking away. A few seemed not to know if he still worked there. Colton opened the ceremony with a confident nod, thanking the team for pushing through a difficult quarter. He praised cross-functional collaboration, highlighted key wins, and made a point to emphasize how lean innovation had restructured outdated logistics. When he moved to the awards, he began by calling department leads to present gifts to their top performers. One by one, team members stepped forward to accept small glass plaques and gift cards. Their names were met with polite claps and occasional cheers. Then Colton reached into the drawer beneath the podium and pulled out a small plastic trophy, the kind found in children's party stores, gold-painted with a plastic star mounted on top. Holding it aloft, he cleared his throat. "This next one," he said, pausing for effect, "goes to someone who's been quietly essential. A true behind-the-scenes hero. You may not know what he does exactly, but if your coffee's hot, your files are delivered, or the lights are still working, chances are you owe it to this guy." The room laughed, uncertain. A few turned toward the back. Colton smiled. "Let's give it up for the man who's mastered the art of disappearing and still making things run. Thaddeus Lane, everybody." The applause came in weak spurts, a few chuckles surfacing as eyes turned to him. Thaddeus remained seated for a second too long before rising slowly, walking to the front of the room in measured steps. He accepted the trophy, his fingers curling around the weightless plastic. Colton patted his back. "A symbol of perseverance," he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Don't drop it, it's worth more than our bonus pool." The room laughed again, louder this time. Thaddeus did not smile. He returned to his seat in silence, trophy in hand, the gold paint already flaking slightly beneath his grip. That afternoon, a photo of the moment appeared on the company intranet under the title Unsung Heroes. The caption read, "Every machine needs its gears. Here's to the ones that keep us running." His name was not tagged. He was not emailed the post. Someone forwarded it to him out of pity. The next day, during a floor-wide tour with a visiting potential investor group, Colton led the entourage through the executive levels, pausing occasionally to introduce his star players. When they neared the operations wing, Colton stopped outside the annex hallway where Thaddeus had been working on reports for the upcoming Tokyo venture. The door was half open. Colton gestured toward it with a casual wave and said, "And back here is where we keep our compliance shadow team. You know, fire drills, light bulbs, facilities things. Vital stuff, but not exactly strategic." The group laughed politely and moved on. Thaddeus, who had overheard the comment while adjusting the HVAC expense sheet, said nothing. He stared at the line item he was about to finalize, blinked once, and closed the document. That evening, his inbox contained a new project brief labeled low priority, involving the transfer of physical archives from the 2009 acquisition of a long-defunct subsidiary. The task was described as suitable for hybrid field review, code for manual labor. No one else was assigned. He spent the next 2 days in a dim off-site storage facility cataloging box after box of old files under a flickering halogen bulb. On his return, the only acknowledgement came from a receptionist who pointed at his shoes, dirted from the site, and suggested he might want to clean up before stepping into client-viewable zones. The following week, during another staff-wide check-in, Colton introduced new hires with an energetic flourish, pausing at the end to welcome our veteran backbone, and motioned at Thaddeus without using his name. "You'll see him around, always working, rarely speaking. Every company has one. We're lucky he's ours." Laughter again. Polite, pitying, confused. Thaddeus stood at the back of the room, hands folded, posture straight. The applause that followed was softer than before. He did not move, and he did not respond. On Thursday, an analyst from procurement approached him in the hallway and handed him a pile of internal mail with a tight smile, saying, "I think this goes to the support pool." Before Thaddeus could answer, the analyst had already walked away. The envelopes were addressed to departments he no longer had access to. He delivered them anyway. Friday ended with a town hall livestream, and Colton was the host again. He closed the session with a series of light-hearted shout-outs. The last slide displayed a photo of Thaddeus pushing a cart full of documents through a hallway. His suit was crisp, his shoes shined, and his expression unreadable, as it had been for days, even weeks, now that the humiliation had moved from subtle to systemic, and then to spectacle. But something beneath that practiced stillness had begun to shift. He could feel it, a tension coiling behind the quiet, a line slowly reaching its final inch. He opened his laptop, resumed analysis of the backlog related to the Tokyo M&A files, and began structuring his risk memo with annotations no one would read. Before his second paragraph, a new email arrived from Executive Ops. Subject line: Client Strategy Meeting 9 a.m. Boardroom A. No explanation, no agenda, just a single line at the bottom. Please ensure refreshments are prepared in advance. His hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment. He hadn't been invited to a strategy meeting since his first week, at least not as a participant. And this invitation wasn't even addressed directly to him. It had gone to a list of logistics contacts. Still, he shut the laptop, straightened his tie, and walked the 23 flights up to Boardroom A. The hallway outside the room was already filled with chatter. Associates in tailored suits shook hands and compared notes. Colton Mars stood near the door, speaking with a client representative in a designer blazer. When Thaddeus approached, Colton glanced at him without recognition, then turned back to his conversation. Without a word, Thaddeus entered the boardroom and began arranging the coffee and tea service, laying out carafes and cups with mechanical precision, lining napkins into perfect rows, adjusting the sugar trays. He was invisible again, and everyone seemed at ease with that. When the meeting began, he remained in the corner of the room, standing as if waiting for another instruction. A few chairs down, someone motioned toward the front table and whispered, "Can you get the HDMI cable fixed?" Thaddeus nodded and made the adjustment. When the slides flickered to life, Colton took center stage, opening with a confident summary of projected growth trends. As he launched into the Q2 forecast, several charts appeared on screen. Charts Thaddeus had built, models he had cross-verified, and data pipelines he had stabilized during late hours in that underground office. But Colton never mentioned his name. The entire presentation was a repackaged version of memos Thaddeus had sent over the last 10 days. He recognized his own phrasing, his own formatting, even the order of the slides. He said nothing. Near the end of the meeting, Colton paused and looked around the room with an almost theatrical grin. "Of course, none of this would work without the gears behind the curtain," he said. "We've got a lot of hands keeping this place humming, especially our ops team. Can't do much without good coffee and working screens." Laughter followed. Thaddeus stood in silence, back straight, eyes locked forward. He didn't flinch, didn't shift. He waited. After the meeting ended, he began collecting the coffee cups and glasses as the others filed out. A visiting director from the London office mistook him for a junior contractor and asked where the restroom was. He pointed without speaking. On his way back to the basement, he passed the reception desk. A courier was dropping off packages. The receptionist waved toward Thaddeus. "You can leave them with him," she said. "He handles building stuff." The courier did as instructed. He handed over the clipboard. Thaddeus signed. No one asked if he had time for anything else. That afternoon, Colton sent an internal memo to the strategy department, praising the seamless delivery of today's session and commending the team for its professionalism. He CC'd everyone involved. Thaddeus was not among them. At 4 p.m., an alert pinged on his calendar. Performance calibration for 30 HR Suite 2B. He hadn't received a formal review since his reassignment. He walked to the suite on time. The HR representative waiting inside had a tablet open and a neutral expression. "We're doing touch points across auxiliary departments," she said. Your records show minimal strategic contribution, inconsistent visibility, and limited peer interaction. Can you explain that?" Thaddeus sat without speaking for a moment. The room was quiet. He wanted to laugh. Instead, he leaned forward and began listing every project he had submitted, every model stolen, every email ignored. He spoke clearly, unemotionally, itemizing the weeks of theft, omission, and quiet sabotage. The HR rep frowned slightly. "If you felt your work was being misattributed," she said, "you should have escalated. Silence can be interpreted as disengagement." Thaddeus exhaled once. A short, sharp breath. No words followed. The review ended in 10 minutes. She thanked him for his time and suggested he monitor his inbox for growth planning tools. On his way back to the basement, the elevator stopped at the executive floor. Colton stepped in. They stood side by side in silence as the car descended. At floor 16, Colton glanced over, still smirking faintly. "You clean up all right," he said. "Shame you don't speak up more." Thaddeus didn't answer. When the elevator opened, he stepped out and kept walking. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the floor emptied, he remained at his desk. He opened a new spreadsheet, entered a header labeled Q3 Risk Map, and typed 3 rows. Then he stopped. His hands sat still. His eyes locked on the screen. The plastic trophy he'd been given 2 weeks earlier still sat in his drawer. He opened it, took the object out, stared at it for a moment, then gently set it on the center of his desk. Its gold paint had begun to peel. But now, each keystroke he made on the keyboard was methodical in a new way, each line of data cross-checked with precise intent. The reports he had once sent without reply were now being logged in a separate directory, one only he had access to. The documents that had once disappeared into Colton's hands now had metadata embedded with custom markers, dates, and microchanges. Everything he submitted was now time-stamped, protected, backed up across private channels. For weeks he had endured, absorbed, obeyed. But now, the performance was ending, and none of them had noticed. That morning, a calendar invitation landed in his inbox, this time from Corporate Strategy. It was brief, vague, and time-stamped for 11:15 a.m. in Executive Conference Room West. There were no listed attendees, no subject matter disclosed. The message was signed by Grafton Merrill, Senior Acquisition Director of Langford Equity Partners. Thaddeus blinked at the name once, then closed the invite without hesitation. He did not reply. He simply stood, adjusted his tie, and returned to work until the appointed time. At precisely 11:13, he shut his laptop, walked to the elevator, and made his way toward the conference room. This time, he did not hesitate. He walked with the calm certainty of someone who already knew the outcome. The room was expansive, framed in mahogany and brushed steel, with sunlight pouring through double-pane windows that overlooked the East River. Grafton Merrill stood near the window, flipping through a folder, flanked by 2 colleagues in dark suits. When Thaddeus entered, Grafton looked up, smiled faintly, and extended his hand. There was no confusion, no misidentification, no awkward pause. "Mr. Lane," he said calmly, "thank you for meeting us." Thaddeus shook his hand, took the seat offered, and opened the portfolio in front of him. The next 45 minutes unfolded with mechanical clarity. Financial summaries were exchanged. Due diligence observations were presented. Thaddeus offered answers, not explanations. He moved with the fluency of someone who had once been written out of the narrative, but never stopped studying the script. The Langford team asked about projected redundancies. He responded with a streamlined transition plan. They asked about cultural risk. He cited months of first-hand observation. They reviewed strategic misalignments. He highlighted Colton's pattern of internal misrepresentation and unethical attribution. Each point came with receipts. Not digital, not soft. Printed copies, signatures, metadata, timestamps, direct quotes. Everything the partners needed to understand not just the operational failure, but the institutional rot hiding behind polished language and curated images. Grafton asked one final question, unrelated to the documents in front of them. "Do you believe the executive team is aligned with Langford's values?" Thaddeus looked him in the eye and responded with perfect control. "They are aligned with appearance, not principle. I believe the distinction will become self-evident." The meeting ended at 12:04. No handshakes this time, just a shared nod and a silent understanding. As Thaddeus exited the room, he did not return to the basement. Instead, he walked through the main floor toward the lounge, where Colton and several department heads stood mid-conversation, laughing as they scanned a whiteboard filled with team projections. Colton looked up, saw him, and gave his usual smirk. "Need something, Forrest?" he said aloud, using the wrong name again. Thaddeus kept walking. No reply, no reaction, just silence. But his silence no longer meant submission. It meant precision. That afternoon, an email blast went out across the firm, announcing an emergency alignment session scheduled for the following morning with the Langford acquisition team. All department leads were to attend. No exceptions. Thaddeus's name appeared on the list, this time properly placed. No nickname, no mocking title, no logistics tag. Just his full name and the designation, Evaluation Liaison. For the first time, people noticed. Colleagues who had passed him for weeks without eye contact now offered quick glances, trying to place his face. Interns whispered. A few assistants stared too long. Colton's assistant blinked 3 times at the screen before rushing to confirm the calendar entry. But Thaddeus said nothing. He went back to work. That evening, he did not leave through the basement. He took the main elevator to the ground floor, walked past the receptionist, and exited through the front entrance into the city's cooling dusk. On the sidewalk, his pace never changed. He walked like a man on schedule, not because he was rushing, but because his timing was deliberate. Every step taken that day had been arranged, anticipated, calculated. Others, including Colton Marr, assumed it was performative, the kind of showy meeting that precedes an acquisition with minimal consequence for internal leadership. Colton arrived 5 minutes late, confidently dressed, nodding at assistants and smirking at 2 junior directors he had mentored through intimidation. He entered the conference suite without knocking and dropped his phone on the table with the swagger of someone certain of his position. What he didn't expect to see was Thaddeus Lane already seated at the head of the table, positioned directly beside Grafton Merrill and 2 Langford executives who were mid-discussion and consulting a dossier of documents opened in front of them. The room was quiet when Colton entered. He paused, his smirk faltering for the briefest second before he regained it. "Didn't realize the AV guy was on the board today," he said under his breath as he slid into his chair, his voice just loud enough for those closest to him to hear. But no one laughed. No one looked amused. One of the Langford advisors, Carla Dorsey, head of strategic transitions, looked up at Colton with a narrowed gaze, then back to the pages in front of her. Grafton didn't look at him at all. Instead, he turned toward Thaddeus and said, "Mr. Lane, would you like to begin with the preliminary assessment?" The words hung in the air like a dropped pane of glass. For a split second, the room didn't react. Then heads turned. Eyes shifted. Someone at the far end of the table dropped their pen. Colton froze. His lips parted, but no sound followed. Thaddeus remained still, composed, posture exact. He reached into the slim folder before him, withdrew 3 printed charts, and laid them on the table one by one, each sheet marked with internal tracking metadata, timestamps, and color-coded annotations. His voice was calm, measured, resonant, not loud, but undeniable. He began by outlining Langford's acquisition interest, summarizing the firm's proposed structure and the rationale behind operational audits conducted over the previous quarter. He then explained how internal misalignment between stated policy and actual practice had created a brand risk that Langford could no longer ignore. He cited departments. He referenced patterns. He mentioned names. And when he reached the topic of misattribution, workplace manipulation, and the sustained marginalization of key contributors, his tone did not waver. He did not raise his voice, nor did he accuse anyone directly. Instead, he read aloud selected entries from internal performance memos, entries written by Colton himself. each followed by a correction supported with email chains, timestamp revisions, and side-by-side comparisons of submitted work versus presented materials. By the time he reached the fifth entry, the room was still. Colton sat rigid in his seat, his palms flat against the conference table, his jaw tight. No one interrupted. No one objected. Thaddeus continued, transitioning seamlessly into the structure of his liaison appointment. He explained how 2 months earlier, Langford Equity Partners had embedded him in the operational framework of Halverson and Burke as part of a live integrity audit, requested after inconsistencies were identified in quarterly data and behavior flagged during a pre-acquisition due diligence cycle. He detailed how his role had been designed to simulate entry-level exposure while maintaining access to strategic data channels. He had been tasked not only with analysis, but with observation, tracking the daily conduct, culture, and ethical fidelity of the firm's leadership. He had not just been an employee, he had been the test. And Colton had failed, thoroughly, systematically, publicly. When Thaddeus concluded, he closed the folder gently and folded his hands. The silence that followed was not uncertain, it was heavy. Carla Dorsey addressed the room next. Her voice was clipped and precise. She confirmed everything. The audit had been real. The partnership review was real. And Halverson and Burke's acquisition, valued at $2.7 billion, was now suspended pending an internal restructuring of executive leadership. Colton stood up slowly, like a man waking from a dream that had taken too long to sour. He tried to speak, but Grafton raised a single hand. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "We've seen enough." A beat passed. Then another. And then Colton left the room. No apology. No defense. Just a long walk from one end of the table to the door, past the faces that had once laughed at his jokes, followed his orders, and watched silently as he destroyed another man's dignity for sport. Thaddeus remained seated. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply picked up his pen, flipped to a fresh page, and began writing again. That afternoon, the news circulated through the firm like an electrical surge. The acquisition had frozen. The acquisition freeze sent a shockwave through shareholders and rattled the firm's valuation by 5% in less than 48 hours. What had once been a near-certain multi-billion-dollar deal was now a teetering structure of broken trust and corporate malpractice. And at the center of it all stood a man whose name most had ignored, belittled, or forgotten until now. Thaddeus Lane had not requested a new title. He had not claimed a corner office or demanded a press release. Instead, he returned to the building on Wednesday with the same calm stride and tailored suit, entered through the main entrance this time, not the freight corridor, and passed through security without showing his badge. The guard who had once looked through him now stood when he approached, nodded respectfully, and held the door. Upstairs, whispers preceded him in every hallway. Conversations stopped when he entered. Associates who had once dumped errands into his hands now turned away with eyes fixed on the floor. HR issued an internal memo identifying a period of executive realignment and suspended Colton Marr indefinitely pending a review of ethical violations, misrepresentation of team outputs, and potential breaches of corporate fiduciary conduct. His office was sealed, his assistant reassigned, his name wiped from the leadership directory by the end of the day. Word spread fast. But that was only the surface. The deeper reckoning unfolded slowly, like the peeling back of old wallpaper to reveal mold and decay beneath. Langford's audit team, led by Carla Dorsey, initiated one-on-one interviews with every department under Colton's purview. Anonymous reporting links flooded with testimonials, stories of suppressed credit, unacknowledged contributions, forced overtime, gaslighting, even retaliation masked as performance recalibrations. Most had remained silent for fear of reprisal. Now they spoke freely, and every word added weight to the case already built by Thaddeus's meticulous documentation. One analyst recounted how she'd been reprimanded for raising the same strategic concerns that Colton later repackaged and submitted to the board. Another remembered how Thaddeus had corrected her valuation model late one night, saving her from public embarrassment. Yet Colton had marked her report needs mentorship. In conference rooms across 3 floors, these stories piled into a collective indictment, a portrait of a culture designed not just to succeed, but to suppress. By Friday, 2 more department heads were placed on leave. Colton's former allies began crafting quiet exit strategies, burying documents, deleting chat histories, redrafting policies. None of it worked. Langford had already pulled network records, recovered metadata trails, and mapped out a digital footprint that told a clearer story than any memo ever could. It was all there. The stolen credit, the reworded memos, the strategic theft that had become company ritual. And it wasn't just Colton. The rot had roots. Meanwhile, Thaddeus operated with quiet precision, not as a figurehead of vengeance, but as a calm administrator of truth. He worked directly with Langford's transition team, facilitating structural changes, reviewing operational bottlenecks, advising on cultural shifts. Every meeting he attended now began on time. Every word he spoke was documented. His authority was no longer questioned. It was understood. Yet he did not gloat. He did not correct the whispers or relish the reversal of power. He simply delivered the truth with the same quiet that had once made him invisible. Only now, that quiet commanded attention. The most startling moment came Monday morning when Thaddeus entered the 35th floor war room with Langford's final recommendation package. At the head of the table sat Gordon Halverson, the firm's co-founder and namesake, flown in from Geneva, where he'd spent the last decade in semi-retirement. He watched silently as Thaddeus laid out the restructuring blueprint: executive reassignments, cultural training mandates, a new oversight model for credit attribution, and a redefinition of internal hierarchy based on contribution instead of title. Gordon said little until the end, when he folded his hands and asked a single question. "If you had spoken up sooner, would this have changed?" Thaddeus replied without anger, without blame. "I did speak. You just built a system that didn't listen." The words settled in the room like judgment. No one argued. The final decision came that evening. Langford would proceed with the acquisition, contingent on the immediate removal of 3 senior leaders, a public acknowledgement of internal mismanagement, and the installment of Thaddeus Lane as interim director of organizational strategy. It was not a promotion. It was a reset. And yet, for the staff who had watched his daily descent into manufactured irrelevance, it was a revelation. On Wednesday, a firm-wide email arrived, subject line, "Moving forward with integrity." It detailed the transition, named those stepping down, and introduced Thaddeus with a brief paragraph. No fanfare, no theatrics, just facts. By Thursday, the cubicle he'd been banished to in the basement was cleared, repainted, and converted into a new training space. The storage closet where his name had once been scratched out now bore a printed sign, reserved for new higher orientation, inspired by Mr. Lane's journey. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As the office returned to operational rhythm, a new awareness pulsed beneath the surface. Jokes changed tone. Meetings invited broader voices. Associates stopped assuming. The weeks that followed did not begin with applause or fanfare, nor did they unfold with cinematic resolve or dramatic reversals. Halverson and Burke continued to operate as a high-functioning firm in a high-stakes industry, but beneath the familiar polish, something fundamental had shifted. Not just in leadership, not merely in policy, but in conscience. With Thaddeus Lane now formally appointed as Director of Organizational Strategy, his presence redefined the room before he even spoke. Yet he carried the authority not with the sharp edge of vindication, but with a steady hand shaped by discipline, by humility, and by the bitter patience of those who have survived deliberate erasure. He never sought to mimic the hierarchy he had dismantled, nor did he impose the silence he once endured on others. Instead, he instituted a model of operational transparency, creating systems where ideas were not just captured but attributed, where contribution was measured in results rather than rhetoric, and where mentorship flowed across titles, not just upward. In weekly roundtables, he asked questions of the most junior associates first. He revisited proposals from those overlooked, even inviting feedback anonymously to remove fear from critique. Slowly, trust began to regenerate, not as a performance, but as a habit. Meanwhile, Coltamar reemerged far from the skyscraper corridors he once ruled. For weeks he had vanished into silence, insulated by legal teams and PR advisors, buried beneath drafts of statements never released. At first he clung to bitterness, composing letters full of self-defense and industry jargon, rewriting the narrative in his own mind to cast himself as victim of a ruthless audit, a scapegoat for larger dysfunctions. But denial decays under isolation, and in the quiet hours after the noise of his own ambition had faded, Colton began to reflect, not in the abstract, but with the uncomfortable clarity that comes when no one is left to flatter you. He reviewed old emails. He read every memo Thaddeus had submitted. He examined meeting transcripts, parsed language he had once dismissed. And eventually, he stopped seeing himself as a man wronged by exposure and began recognizing himself as a man blinded by entitlement. The memory that haunted him most was not the conference room takedown or the revocation of his title. It was the moment Thaddeus had stood behind him carrying boxes of executive gifts while others laughed. That silence, that refusal to react, it hadn't been weakness. It had been restraint. Colton realized that the man he had mocked was the only one in the building who had known the full scope of the firm's operations, not because he'd read more spreadsheets, but because he'd seen it from beneath, where the pressure was heaviest. 3 months later, Colton sent a letter. It wasn't addressed to HR or legal or the board. It was written by hand, sent in a plain envelope, and delivered directly to Thaddeus's new office. In it, he admitted fault, not in the hollow phrasing of legal deflection, but in detail. He named the things he had done, the harm it had caused, and the people he had failed. He asked for nothing in return. He wrote because it was time. Thaddeus read the letter once. He didn't frame it. He didn't file it away in some drawer of personal victories. He simply placed it in a folder marked accountability and continued with his work. The act was not for revenge. It was for history. And history, he understood, must not be hidden if a future is to be different. Over the following months, others came forward. Quiet emails, unexpected conversations. Former peers approached him to share regrets, not out of fear, but out of a shifting moral gravity. They had seen what power looked like when stripped of cruelty, when grounded in clarity and calm. Some asked how they could help rebuild. Others simply asked to listen. And Thaddeus, who had once endured humiliation by standing silently in rooms where others laughed, now filled those same rooms with purpose, not punishment. When asked in a leadership Q&A what moment had taught him the most, he didn't cite his appointment or the exposure or even the acquisition. He spoke of a day when a team member brought him a pile of misdelivered mail, and he delivered it anyway, not because it was his job, but because he understood what people become when no one sees them. That was the lesson, he said. Never underestimate the person doing the job you think you're above. The real strength of a company is not measured by its margins or awards, but by how it treats those who can't fight back. The audience was silent, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. There was no applause, just understanding. That was enough. Outside the building, the season shifted. The cold rains gave way to longer days, warmer streets, quieter nights. The skyline hadn't changed, but the people inside had. And though the name Halverson and Burke still gleamed from the tower side, those within its walls moved differently now. More mindful, less certain, more open, less afraid. Justice had not arrived in a storm. It had arrived one act at a time, quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. And at the heart of it stood a man who had been everything they ignored until the moment they could not. A man who never shouted to be heard, but who proved that dignity, once buried, does not die. It waits, it endures, and when the time is right, it rises, not for revenge, but to restore what was broken. That was the end, and that was the beginning, the end. If you've been following this story and felt the weight of its message, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. What did you think of the twists, the downfall, and the redemption arc? Which part hit the hardest? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from and how the plot made you feel. Let's talk about justice, power, and what true leadership looks like.